get started now. Thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see a lot of new faces, a lot of returning faces, a lot of friendly faces. So thank you guys for being here. My name is Megan Mello. I'm the Vice President of Precision Athletic Training and in charge of running events like these. If you are interested in ever presenting an event like this, let me know. We're always looking for speakers. Now, let me introduce our speaker for the evening. Lori earned her Bachelor's of Science in Athletic Training at Westfield State University and is currently a graduate student in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program at UMass Lowell. At Westfield State, she ran on the cross-country and track teams and completed her Commonwealth Honors Scholar research project titled REDS, the relationship between disordered eating in male and female athletes. At UMass Lowell, Lori works as an athletic trainer for club sports athletes. Ladies and gentlemen, Lori Merlo.
All right, thank you. So when I saw that this event was being advertised, and it was like, come for dinner and drinks and learn about disordered eating, I was like, that's a little bit ironic. Hope nobody feels judged. Definitely help yourself to more food, and judgment-free zone here. So we're going to talk today about relative energy deficit in sport, which is REDS. And specifically, I want to talk about how it applies to your athletic training practice and the relationship between disordered eating and athletic injury. So here are some slides that I was required to put in. Basically, no conflicts of interest, no disclosures. We don't discriminate here at Precision. So the objectives you should have seen already in the advertisements, but basically I want you to walk away from this lecture with a better understanding of what REDS is, and also have some clinically applicable knowledge of how to recognize it in your athletes, how to manage it, and how to prevent it too. So the female athlete triad is something you should all probably know about, and that's mainly you probably learned about the eating disorders causing menstrual dysfunction and causing osteoporosis. So that was the main idea. And then in 2007, the ACSM released a position statement that described it more as a sliding scale, as we see here, between healthy and the complete full-blown female athlete triad symptoms. So anywhere on the sliding scale of disordered eating, reduced energy availability, subclinical menstrual disorders, and low bone mineral density. If your athletes fall anywhere along there, then they can be affected by the triad. So then in 2014, the International Olympic Committee came out with a position statement basically expanding the female athlete triad and introducing this concept of REDS in order to replace it. So relative energy deficiency in sport is defined as impaired physiological functioning caused by relative energy deficiency and includes, but is not limited to, impairments of metabolic rate, menstrual function, bone health, immunity, protein synthesis, and cardiovascular health. So the etiological factor of this is low energy availability. So it's the same etiology as female athlete triad, but this basically just expands it so that it's not just those three factors, it's all the different systems that are involved, and also it expands it from just female athletes to male athletes as well. So there's still a lot of research to be done on male athletes, since traditionally all the research has been done on females because of the female athlete triad concept. So there's more research to be done on males, and the preliminary research right now is still showing higher rates of REDS in females than in males, but there still is a prevalence in males. The research that I did in undergrad actually found that there was a higher prevalence in females as well. So now this is the big schematic that I came up with to describe what REDS is. So it begins with low energy availability, which is basically a mismatch between the amount of energy that you take in and the amount of energy that you expend. And that leads to the body entering energy conservation mode, which is manifest by hormonal changes. And that leads to body-wide systemic dysfunction, and that causes ultimately injury and illness throughout the body. So first we'll take a look at low energy availability. So basically, the main idea is that you are taking an insufficient amount of energy, and then your body needs to compromise and cut back on expending energy elsewhere. So this is the formula. It's used in the research, but it's not really clinically applicable here. Mostly this is just for the theoretical knowledge of what energy availability is. So it's basically you take your energy intake, how many calories you're taking in, and then subtract out the amount of energy that you're expending through exercise above your daily activities, and divide it by your fat-free mass. So in the research, they generally say that this, it says that this is individualized rates, levels to each individual athlete, but in general, they use the threshold of 45 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day as the idea of what optimal energy availability is, and they use less than 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day to categorize people into low energy availability. So this is a graphic that really explains what low energy availability is pretty well. So in the middle here, we have your athlete who has optimal energy availability. You see that their energy intake is way high. It's adequate for supporting both of their training needs and also their life processes. You see this threshold line, and their energy is meeting that threshold line, as well as their energy expenditure through exercise. So if we move over to the right here, there's an athlete who's overtraining. So they are using so much of their energy, they're taking in enough energy, but they're using so much of their energy for exercise and for training that they don't have enough energy left over to meet that threshold line that's left over for their life processes. So they need to cut back energy somewhere. And to the left here, you have an athlete who has low energy availability. They have a lower energy intake to begin with. And so they're still going to expend the same amount of energy on their training as their healthy teammate right here, but they aren't taking in enough calories to begin with, so they don't have enough. They're not meeting this threshold line. So they don't have enough energy left over after their training for their life processes. So low energy availability can be either intentional or unintentional. And when it's intentional, this is what we call disordered eating or eating disorders. So more of your athletes will fall in this gray area here of disordered eating than eating disorders. There's a big stigma with, if I start talking about disordered eating to somebody, they just ultimately think that I'm talking automatically about eating disorders. So an eating disorder is like what you think of with anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. It's clinically diagnosable using the DSM-5 criteria. So most of our athletes don't have eating disorders. More often they'll have disordered eating, which is everything in this gray area, which includes restrictive eating, fasting, frequently skipped meals, diet pills, laxatives, diuretics, enemas, overeating, and binging and purging. So disordered eating is developed by a number of factors. One of the big ones is the cultural messages and values that are in America. So basically, America, the whole culture fosters a fear of fat, with the ideal like thin body image. You see all these ads constantly about weight loss. These ads are getting to our athletes too, who don't need to lose weight. So even though there's an obesity epidemic, most of our athletes don't need to lose weight, and they're still getting these messages, and you can't ignore them. And so they're sort of embedded in our culture and in our mindsets. Family messages, values, and behaviors is another big part of just our eating attitudes and the way that we see our bodies too. If you see your parents skipping meals or talking about their body in unhealthy ways, that they don't like their body size or how they look, or if they're constantly dieting, then you're growing up in that culture that you think that you need to constantly diet, that you need to lose weight, skip meals, and you think those are all okay things to do. Which when you're an athlete and you don't need to lose weight, those are not necessarily healthy things to do. So times of transition or change is also a big factor in developing disordered eating. Most of our athletes are in some sort of transition or change when we're working with them. So like high school athletes, middle school athletes, they're going through puberty, so their body's changing. A lot of times this can be seen as negative, especially if, think about a cheerleader, like if you're a flyer and you're all of a sudden going through these changes, you're hitting puberty, and you're not the smallest one on the team anymore. How are you, what's that gonna do to your athletic identity and to your personal identity? You might start to develop disordered eating behaviors because you want to try to stop those changes and you think you need to lose weight to be the smallest one on the team again so that you can keep your position. Other changes or transitions is the transition to high school sports from middle school sports. It might be a little bit of a higher level. The transition from high school to college. All of a sudden you're living on your own, you're responsible for eating on your own, your parents aren't cooking for you, you need to be the one looking out for yourself, making sure that you're getting all your meals. Also, most of your meals are probably going to be eaten with your teammates, so you might feel judged in that way. You might not feel as comfortable with eating everything you should be. So social media and role models also are a big factor in the development of disordered eating. So up here we have a picture of Caitlin Alhashi. I don't know if anybody's familiar with her, but she's a gymnast at UCLA. She's been getting a lot of press coverage lately, and she's actually come out with a blog called Behind the Madness and a video on the Players Tribune that I encourage you all to check out. She talks about how when she was a teenager, she was in elite level gymnastics and actually went through some body image stuff where when she hit puberty and her body started changing, her coaches were really body shaming her and they were making her feel like she needed to exercise excessively and she was skipping meals. She was exercising before bed. She would get kicked out of practice and told to just run laps and stuff instead of practicing. So now she was actually about to go to the Olympic trials, I believe, and got a fracture in her back because she had reds from all this disordered eating behaviors. So now she's competing and doing really well at UCLA and really raising awareness, which is cool. And then this is a runner, Ryan Hall. He's an elite runner who he is now retired from running, and he's a bodybuilder. And a lot of people in the running community are talking about how he has gained a lot of weight and how his body looks so different. And he's come out with some statements saying that when he was a runner, he was a really good runner, but his energy levels were so low when he wasn't running. He was just so fatigued, he needed a nap to get through like every day. So it's just wanted to show you that our athletes are seeing these elite runners and these elite athletes here, and they're seeing them in their body image, and they don't really know everything that's going on behind it. So if they try to live up to that ideal, they may be developing unhealthy behaviors too. So the development of disordered eating in athletes in particular is good to talk about because our athletes are at a higher risk of developing disordered eating than the general population. So one of the big things is performance pressure from both the athletes themselves, from the coaches, parents, recruiters, teammates. You don't want to let anybody down. And so these athletes might feel these pressures to perform even better. And because of these pressures, they want to get that little extra edge, and they might think they should start to control their diet a little bit better. And that can easily slip into disordered eating behaviors. One study that I read found that 60% of high school athletes felt the pressure to be a certain weight, and they cited that most of the pressure was from themselves and from social media. So it just talks to our culture that we're cultivating with this fear of that. 60% is quite a bit. So injuries also is somewhere where we can really step in and prevent the disordered eating behaviors, because if somebody has like an ACL tear or some other really big injury that's going to keep them out for the rest of the season or the rest of the year, they're definitely going to be afraid of losing muscle mass, being deconditioned, changing body composition. And that's a really real fear. So it might be our spot to, and sports nutrition spot to actually help them deal with some, counsel them on some nutrition advice for while they're injured, and working with the strength coach or working with the athletic trainer and the coach to come up with some strengthening activities so that they don't have those adverse body composition. They don't need to be afraid of gaining weight with this injury. So teammates and peers are also really important because they really create the culture, and the team culture is very important. Because if you're eating, if you're living and studying and practicing with your teammates, like if you're in college, then you're always feel like you're being judged by your teammates for what you're doing. And you need to make sure that team culture is there and that everybody understands that what's healthy and what's not healthy, and try to foster this idea that you can go up for seconds, thirds, fourths. I'm saying you should all go up for seconds also. That's what that was. And the coach also plays into the creating team culture, but also the way that the coach even speaks to their athletes can really affect how athletes feel about their bodies and about their nutrition. Even some offhand comments that the coaches don't even realize that they're saying, comments about athletes' weight or how they look. They may not think anything of it, but it really can get to an athlete. So if you see those things happening, you hear anything like that, it might be our job to sort of speak up and intervene there and just tell the coach afterwards that, like, maybe be a little more sensitive about that. And then the personality traits was the last bullet there. So personality traits of an athlete when they're trying to get to that next level can really translate very easily into the personality traits of individuals with eating disorders. So I like this chart because it really, you can see how they correlate so easily. So mental toughness, commitment to training, pursuit of excellence, coachability, unselfishness, performance despite pain. These all sound like really good things that we want to see in our athletes to help them excel. But those also really easily translate to asceticism, excessive exercise, perfectionism, overcompliance, selflessness, or denial of discomfort. So if they're just trying to get that extra edge by sort of starting to look at their diet, they can easily slip into these disordered eating habits. So some athletes, because of the sport that they play, are at a higher risk for developing disordered eating. It's not limited to these sports necessarily, because the athletes of all types of sports can develop disordered eating, of course, but their highest rates among aesthetic sports, so dance, gymnastics, and figure skating, because part of their score might be based on how they look. Endurance sports, like running, cycling, or swimming, because the less weight that they have to move over a distance, the faster they can go, the more efficient they are. Weight class sports like wrestling, crew, bodybuilding, and horse jockey. There's a lot of unhealthy behaviors with weight cycling right before competitions and meets that can even last to unhealthy behaviors that last beyond their sport participation. So energy conservation mode is the next part of the schematic over here. So we're done talking about low energy availability. So that causes the body to enter on energy conservation mode because there's not quite enough energy left over for those basic life processes like we saw in that image in the beginning. So the body needs to cut back calories and energy expenditure elsewhere. So mostly it cuts back on everything that's not needed for immediate survival, like fat accumulation, growth, and development, and especially reproduction also. That's why we see in the female athlete triad, menstruation was one of the big factors. So this image is sort of hard to see up here probably, but basically it just is a big overview of showing that hormone changes happen all over the body, and it cuts back a little, like a few calories here, a few calories there, like cuts back a little bit on all the processes around the body. So we're gonna go into some of them here just briefly. So the adrenal glands are affected, especially with low energy availability. There's an increase in cortisol, is one of the big hormones, and the cortisol is part of your sympathetic nervous system, so your fight or flight system. When you increase your cortisol, you're going to increase catabolism or breakdown. So you're going to increase glucogenesis, so using up all your glycogen stores. And then that also increases proteolysis, which is the breakdown of protein. And athletes don't want to be breaking down their proteins and using that for energy. They really want to be building their proteins in their muscles. So now the these are the reproductive functions. One of the big effects here, hormonally, is you have a change in low energy availability leads to a change in your body composition. So you have initially a decreased fat mass. So your estrogen and testosterone are produced by your adipose tissue and also stored in your adipose tissue. So when you have decreased fat mass, you actually have a decrease in estrogen and testosterone production and storage. So that leads to lots of different changes that you see up here. So decreased bone mineral density, which is the big one that we hear about with the triad. Negative effects on muscle repair, regenerative processes, and post-exercise muscle damage, menstrual dysfunction in females, and decreased muscle mass and decreased sperm production in males. So just taking a minute to talk about menstrual dysfunction. It's one of the big factors in the triad, and it's one of the most easily identifiable symptoms that we may see in our female athletes. So the biggest thing that we'll see is secondary functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. So basically that just means that with low energy availability, the pituitary gland is going to release less luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and that causes a decrease in estrogen. So then they start missing their periods. So technically, secondary amenorrhea is when after a female's gotten their period for the first time, they skip 3 periods in a row. And so that's seen quite commonly, but it also can be masked by if the females are using oral contraceptives for any reason. So then they might not even realize that they have low energy availability because they don't have these symptoms. So other forms of menstrual dysfunction that are seen with low energy availability are anovulation, which is when you don't produce an egg with your menstrual cycle, but that's sort of difficult to measure. And then also luteal phase defects, which is a cycle lasting less than 22 days. Oligomenorrhea, which is a cycle lasting greater than 35 days. And then primary amenorrhea, which is when you don't get your first period by age 16. So now we're going to talk about the thyroid. So the thyroid is really important for reproductive function, for growth, and for metabolism. So actually decreased T3 can also lead to stunted growth. So when you have low energy availability, you have decrease in T3, you can have stunted growth, you can have decreased muscular endurance, increased reaction time, and fatigue and delayed recovery. By all of these mechanisms here that I'm not going to get into because feel like we don't really need to go quite that deep. So some other energy conservation mechanisms that the body goes into when there's low energy availability is decreased resting metabolic rate by all the mechanisms we've been talking about. Increased fat storage because you have an increase in ghrelin, and decreased glycolysis and energy production because you have a decrease in insulin. You have decreased appetite, which is very interesting because you have an increase in leptin. So then it's not necessarily helpful to just tell your athlete that, oh, just eat when you're hungry. Listen to your body, because they may not get those hunger cues because they have actual hormonal changes going on. It's not all in their head. And then all the rest of these are from an increase in oxytocin. So increased anxiety and depression, increased reward-related eating. So reward-related eating is actually when it's more of that temptation and that binging where you feel like uncontrollable urge to eat something for pleasure. It's not hunger-driven eating. It's like driven by that pleasure system. And then increased cortisol, which we talked about earlier, which is your adrenal glands, and decreased regulation of glucose. So for bone health, that's one of the biggest factors that we think about with our bone, with increased stress fractures, increased fractures, osteoporosis, and osteopenia. So with low energy availability, of course, your athletes are at higher risk for low bone mineral density by all these different factors here. And so if you are concerned about an athlete with low bone mineral density, you think they might have that because they're having multiple stress fractures, or they broke a bone by some mechanism that doesn't quite add up, that you wouldn't think they would break a bone from. You might want to refer them for a DEXA scan, which is the gold standard for measuring bone mineral density. So this study found they looked at males and females who were elite 5K runners and race walkers. And they found that 40% of the elite runners were either amenorrheic, so they didn't get their period, or had low testosterone, which is the equivalent in males. And they all had low T3 levels of that 40%. And these athletes were at a 4.5 times greater incidence of bone injuries compared with controls. So there's definitely a big correlation there to look out for those red flags. So bone health is really important to talk about because our athletes are mostly under 30, and by age 30, you've accumulated 99% of your bone mineral density, and you only go downhill from there. Mineral density, building it up in the time that we're working with them. So if they're not eating enough, if they have low energy availability and their levels are low to begin with, then they're at a much greater risk for developing osteoporosis and osteopenia, not only at the time that we're working with them, but also down the road, which they're not going to be thinking about, but we need to look out for their long-term health too. So this is just a little review picture of like a summary of all the hormonal effects and how they accumulate in the body. Two of the things that I want to point out that are pretty big and pretty surprising is that at first you have altered body composition, you see up here, where you have a decreased fat mass, which is what we were talking about earlier with decreasing the estrogen and testosterone. But then at the very end here, as it progresses even further with low energy availability, if it keeps on going, then you actually have adverse body composition. So you start to accumulate more fat and break down that muscle. So I thought that was pretty interesting because if we are testing body composition for our athletes, our athletes could, depending on where they are in this on this progression, they could show increases or decreases in their fat mass. So now we've talked about body energy conservation mode and hormonal changes. We're going to move on to the body-wide systemic dysfunction and injury and illness.
We're going to take a quick break for a hot second. Did anybody park in the lot, like directly across the street?
Yeah.
I need you to move your car. Like there's one right across next to the European Center.
Yeah, the little lot.
The little lot, yeah. I need you to move your car. We're not allowed to park there. And
Okay.
the guy has he doesn't usually care, but he has a party, so.
All right, I'll do that right now.
Thank you. We don't want you to get so. Yeah, that I guess. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about how all those hormonal changes can lead to body-wide systemic dysfunction, injuries, and illnesses now. So this was an image that really just sums up all the different systems that are affected by RED-S. So up here we have menstrual function and bone health, which are the triad components, which we've talked about extensively already. Endocrine function, which we've gone over. Metabolic function, so you have RED-S can lead to a decreased metabolic rate, resting metabolic rate, which we've said already. The hematological function is interesting because RED-S can cause a decrease in iron, so causing like anemia, and also that can further worsen all the other symptoms of RED-S. Think about like fatigue and stuff. And then growth and development is affected. Our athletes might have stunted growth. Psychological factors can be caused by RED-S and also can cause RED-S. Cardiovascular functioning, this can get pretty serious in athletes who have like eating disorders and are further along in the disordered eating, can cause arrhythmias, atherosclerosis, hypotension, and bradycardia. And then GI issues. A lot of our athletes with low energy availability may just have some like weird GI issues going on that the doctors can't necessarily figure out. Based on a lot of different mechanisms. And so there might be like delayed gastric emptying, constipation, increased intestinal transport time, and some just weird GI issues. So that might be a little red flag to look out for too. And then you have a decreased immune system, a suppressed immune system if you have RED-S. So the psychological factors, I said may cause disordered eating and may also be caused and worsened by disordered eating. So common things you might see with people with REDS are depression, anxiety, psychosomatic disorders, social insecurity, fear of weight gain, mood disturbances, distorted body image, and OCD. All these behaviors sort of lend themselves to developing disordered eating and can also be worsened by it. So now we're done with our overview of like our crash course on what REDS is. So now we're going to move on to some more clinically applicable knowledge of exactly like what you can do, what can you start to implement into your athletic training practice. So developing a protocol or sort of plans for how to deal with athletes who might have REDS. So you should develop a protocol or a plan or just think about the different aspects of prevention, identification, treatment, and referral. One study that I read found that D1 colleges were more likely to have referral and treatment protocols for athletes with REDS than D2 and D3 institutions. And so I feel like it's pretty important to talk about what you might do if you do have an athlete that has REDS. So prevention is, of course, one of our specialties as athletic trainers. We see our athletes day in and day out. We're in the unique position where we get to see our athletes before they get injured, and we can actually try to prevent some of those from happening. So with REDS, a big part is educational programs for both the athletes, the coaches, parents, and other healthcare providers, just to try to spread awareness of what REDS is. You want to definitely spread the message that it's not healthy to skip your periods. A lot of female athletes think that it's just a sign that they're training really hard and that they're doing really well. But actually, we should tell them that that's not healthy to do. And we want to educate everybody on what REDS is and what the signs and symptoms are to look out for, which we'll get to later on. And then one study that I read found that peer-led teaching might actually be more effective than teaching from an authoritative figure because it sort of starts to change the team culture surrounding eating behaviors and body image. And another study that I read actually was talking about just even general nutrition advice and sort of teaching your athletes about what their caloric needs are and suggestions for meal prepping and planning in set times to eat during the day, because our athletes are super busy. They have crazy schedules where they might just either forget to eat or not have time to eat a full meal. So one study of ballet students found that that was a big factor in why the athletes weren't getting their enough nutrition and had some nutrition deficiencies because they weren't planning in all that time for meals. So changes to sport regulation policies is another way that we can prevent this from occurring. Basically, if you have teams that do weigh-ins, that do body composition checks, so just looking at all the policies surrounding that at your team, maybe we might be able to be a little more sensitive to our athletes' concerns and make them feel a little more comfortable with that. And then the early detection of symptoms can help prevent REDS from getting even worse. So this study I liked this one because it looked at high school athletes. It surveyed high school athletes and their coaches. There was 170 athletes and 10 coaches. And it found that 87% were considered normal weight based on BMI, which is good. But then 61% of all these athletes wanted to lose weight, even though most of them were a healthy weight. So that was pretty concerning. And then 17% reported a history of stress fracture, and 63% reported menstrual irregularities. So this study only looked at female athletes. And if you consider menstrual irregularity one of the female athlete triad components, and you consider that this might be a very strong indicator of low energy availability, that's pretty concerning that 63% are probably getting low energy or probably have REDS and low energy availability. Another statistic from this was that 9 out of the 170 athletes even knew what the female athlete triad was, and only 3 of the coaches out of 10 knew what the female athlete triad was. So again, the educational component is really important. We might just throw in an educational pamphlet about what REDS is. When we do our concussion, we teach everybody about what concussion signs and symptoms and everything and how we manage them. Maybe we can throw in something about REDS or female athlete triad so that people know that this is a thing and what to look out for. So the early detection of symptoms is pretty important for preventing REDS from getting worse and continuing. So one of the big components for athletic trainers that I see is the AT and athlete relationship, and we see them day in and day out. They tell us like a lot more than everything that we want to hear, and we just need to sort of keep an ear out for any of the red flags that we might hear them talking about of themselves or their teammates. You might hear them say that like their teammate is like skipping meals or isn't going to the team activities, some like social withdrawal there, or they see them at the gym exercising before or after practice. These athletes live with each other, they eat with each other, study, they see each other day in and day out. So just keeping an ear out for any of these red flags. And also maintaining a good relationship with your athletes, so that they trust you and can feel like they can come to you if they are experiencing any disordered eating behaviors, or if they're concerned about anybody else who is experiencing disordered eating. One study that I found said that most female athletes with disordered eating are identified by their teammates, which makes sense to me. Actually, when I was a college athlete, I had a good enough relationship with my athletic trainer that I one time went into her office, asked her to close the door, and told her that I was concerned about one of my teammates. And it's just good that I could have that conversation because I felt like she trusted me, I trusted her, that we could have that open conversation. So also just being familiar with the symptoms for ourselves to look out for and to keep an ear out for, like I was saying. And then preseason screenings are an important time to check in and try to screen for disordered eating behaviors. So this is a big graphic that sort of shows the performance effects of REDS. This might be of interest to your coaches and your athletes to try to get them to buy into it, because none of them want to have any of these effects from low energy availability. So this is one way that you can get them to tell them that they can have decreased muscle strength, increased injury risk, impaired judgment, decreased training response, all of these, irritability, depression. These are all detrimental to your performance. So here's an important slide that I like. It's just, this is what you should look out for. These are the signs and symptoms that indicate that athletes might have REDS. So increased concern about body weight, composition, or body shape or size. Increased concern about healthy eating, setting rules or restrictions or dieting. Orthorexia is a term that's been thrown around talking about an obsession with healthy eating. So this is a big thing when you're an athlete and you're eating healthy with your teammates. They're like, oh, wow, like you eat so healthy, you never eat dessert or whatever. That just reinforces this disordered eating behaviors. And it's really not a healthy cycle. Skipping meals or eating alone. Social withdrawal, they're not going to team activities, changes in weight or body composition, irregular menstruation, fatigue or low energy, change in appetite or sleep, unexplained poor athletic performance and weakness, repeated stress fractures or other injuries, and unresolved GI issues. So REDS is really a diagnosis of exclusion. All of these things you could really attribute to a million other things, other issues. So it's sort of difficult to diagnose, but just if the picture starts to come together, the puzzle pieces start to line up, have this in the back of your mind, definitely, because it's more common than we think. So screening for REDS should take place at the annual physical. We can't necessarily count on the doctors to screen specifically for REDS. So in PPEs that we are conducting or giving our athletes our like health history questionnaires at the beginning of the season, definitely make sure that there's questions that get to some disordered eating behaviors and attitudes, such as if they want to increase or decrease, if they want to gain weight or if they want to lose weight, if they're having regular periods if they're female. Also, we can borrow some of the questions from these other questionnaires. Most of these questionnaires I personally wouldn't recommend for using in clinical practice. They're used in the research. They're not developed for clinical practice. Some of them are pretty long, but you can actually look at these and definitely use some of the questions, borrow some of the questions for your health history questionnaires. One study that I found that only 60% of college ATs screen for disordered eating. So making sure that we actually implement screening procedures is important. There's also difficulty with screening because these questionnaires rely on self-report, which is a big self-report bias because of the stigma surrounding disordered eating and eating disorders. Nobody wants to admit that they actually have issues with that. So that's definitely something to keep in mind too. So for addressing disordered eating in an athlete on a one-on-one sort of conversation, here's some different suggestions on how you can go about that. So set a time to talk. You might say, can I talk with you after practice? Can you see me in my office tomorrow before practice or something? Communicate your concerns, show that you're coming from a place that you care about them and their athletic performance. Ask them to explore these concerns. So sort of like a motivational interviewing technique where you're asking them on what they think and what they think they should be doing rather than seeming like you're telling them what to do. Might make them a little more receptive because people with disordered eating will be very defensive and put up a lot of resistance to you and feel like you're accusing them. So we need to be really careful to avoid conflicts and placing blame. And again, avoid simple solutions. Like I said, they don't have those hunger cues necessarily that we all might rely on. And express your continued support, again, with that athlete relationship. So this is another good, a little more tangible maybe. I'll go through an example that I came up with here. So you can say, I care about your health and performance. Something like I've seen that you're exercising before and after practice extra. I feel like you might be overtraining and not getting enough calories to support your activity levels. I want to see you do well this season. I want you to try to get 3 good meals each day and talk to your coach about adding an extra exercise aside from practice. And I will check in with you next week and see how you're doing. Also probably check in with coach and talk about that. So for how you should manage these athletes that you've identified with RED-S. Of course, the AT is a really big, important role. And then sports psychology also. A lot of athletic programs might not have sports psychology on hand, but if you ever get the funds somehow magically to get sports psychology on board, I highly recommend that because the huge psychological component of training, of sport, of developing disordered eating, and of treating it too. Because it's really a mental state change and an attitude change that you need to instill in your athletes. So also just having a sports psychologist that you might be able to refer out to might be another option if your athletic program doesn't have one. Same with sports nutrition. If you don't have one, highly recommend adding one if there's ever any means to. But also having one on hand that you can refer out to because sports nutrition is important for managing your athletes long-term too, and to get them back on track with getting enough calories and making sure they don't have nutrient deficiencies. The team physician or PCP is important to involve to manage any other medical sequelae that may arise from RED-S. The coach and the strength coach are important to make sure that you're on the same page with them because these athletes might have some restrictions in what they can do. And you want to make sure that everybody's on board and not letting them do more than they're supposed to be doing. And again, if your athlete is medically unstable, of course, they're going to be in inpatient treatment, especially with those cardiovascular complications I was talking about earlier. So a note on oral contraceptives. I know earlier I had said that a lot of our athletes might be on oral contraceptives for one reason or another before they begin sport. And that may mask the symptoms of menstrual irregularity. But also, oral contraceptives are not actually recommended for the treatment of RED-S and for regaining menstruation because it actually has some studies, the research is still out. Some studies have found that it causes a decrease in bone mineral density. Some studies have found that there's no change in bone mineral density, but there's definitely better treatments out there. If it's not being treated through nutrition, if it's not being restored by nutrition, then there's other treatments out there for this. But of course, that's not our decision to make. That's a doctor. So this is a tool that it's free to everybody, to athletic trainers. I'd recommend using it if you have an athlete with RED-S because it sort of goes through risk assessment and steps to stratify people into different categories to guide the return to play decisions. So here it says there's the red, yellow, and green lights. So high risk athletes, and it outlines specifically who's at high risk, what makes them at high risk, and they have no sport participation. Moderate risk athletes are supervised sport participation with medical treatment, and then the low risk are the healthy individuals with full sport participation. So this is a tool that you might want to look at if you have anybody with RED-S, because this is sort of more objective to be like, okay, these are the standards of what we're going to follow. So now here are some resources that I've put together of educational programs that you might want to use with your athletes. I think I actually missed this one. Yeah. So these are different programs that you might want to check out. I haven't personally used any of these, as a disclaimer there, but I was researching what might be good programs to use if you're looking for educational tools for your athletes. So the Athena program, Female Athlete Body Project. I believe this one's still being developed, but that one looked pretty cool. Might be released this year. And then some more resources. The NCAA has some good handouts about disordered eating. The International Olympic Committee has some nutrition handouts for athletes that I've used that just have general nutrition advice. They have the athlete's plate. They have information on disordered eating, nutrient requirements, caffeine, supplements, lots of different stuff there. That's really good. I use all the time. Female Athlete Triad Coalition, they have educational resources for our athletes. NEDA has toolkits for coaches and athletic trainers. And in the Boston Children's Hospital, they have a female athlete program. They have the world-class researchers and doctors there who are actually coming out with all of this new research that I'm looking at. So if you need a referral, of course, Boston Children's is good for that. They also have resources, educational resources as well. Health for Performance is a website that is easy to go through and it has sections for athletes, coaches, and healthcare professionals. And then, of course, there's a few NATA position statements. They're sort of outdated by now and need to be updated, but just had to throw that in there. And now here's an action list that I came up with for what I want you to do to start thinking about RED-S more and implement into your athletic training practice. So think about prevention through educating your athletes. Like I said, you can just throw in an educational pamphlet along with all the concussion forms at the beginning of the year. Changing the stigma in the conversation about disordered eating. Think about the way that you talk about bodies and weight loss and nutrition. Just even when people feel guilty or they say things like, oh yeah, like I can have this dessert because I went to the gym this morning, or like, oh yeah, I'll just run an extra mile tomorrow because I want this piece of cake right now. Like just any of those comments sort of make me cringe. So just sort of be more aware about the way that you talk about our bodies and about food, especially around your athletes. And establish protocols to prevent, identify, treat, and refer your athletes with RED-S. And that's it. Thank you.
I'll start off with how does your assessment and treatment plan change with high school athletes versus college athletes, or does it?
I think that a big factor with high school versus college athletes is the situation they're living in. So if most college athletes are living on campus and eating with their teammates, and they're more responsible for what they're eating versus at home, you might want, if they're living at home, if they're commuting, or if they're high school athletes, you might want to involve the parent more. I mean, of course, you want to involve the parent because they're minors and you need to let the parent know what's going on. But sort of talking to the parent about trying not to accuse them of being a bad parent is a really difficult conversation, of course, because they feel like they're responsible for the nutrition of their student, of their son or daughter. But if they're living on their own, if they're in college, then they're in charge of their nutrition mainly. And you definitely want to talk to them about what options are available at the dining hall. I had an athlete who I was talking to about nutrition he was a basketball athlete and he was trying to gain weight. And he was like, yep, I put on blinders and I go right to the pizza, I go right to the burgers. I'm like, you walk by the salad bar to get to the pizza. So just talking to them about how they can navigate the dining hall is a completely different conversation. Also with how they can plan in eating times and meal times into their schedules. In college is a little bit different from in high school, because in high school they have a set lunch time, and in college they might not.